So we're going to move on to the next session, which is another of our submitted abstract sessions. And it's a real pleasure to be able to hand over the chairing to Dr. Bob Phillips, who's a paediatric oncologist, an amazing dancer, and the chair of our advisory board, and also to Professor Bryony Beresford, the Assistant Director of the Research Centre. So I'm going to hand over to you two for this session. Thank you both.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you, everyone, for staying with us. Yeah, my name is Bob Phillips. I'm a part-time researcher and part-time children's cancer doctor, and also a Leeds Rhinos fan. So it was delightful to see so many pictures of Joe in his Leeds Rhinos kit. Bryony Beresford, a professor and co-director of the centre, is also chairing this session, and we've got a number of sessions here, all about understanding outcomes and taking things forward. I'll hand over to Bryony to introduce the speakers, and then, as with the other ones, we'll try and collect these questions as we go along, please, and then answer them at the end.
Thanks, Bob. Yes, welcome to this session where we have 5 more oral presentations of research, a fantastically interesting bunch of papers. As with the other papers, you can see the full presentation via the recordings on the conference website, and we're going to have sort of some short summaries now. I would encourage you to use the Q&A function as you're listening to presentations, because we're going to run them consecutively and then have a discussion at the end. And I think that worked really well because there's some cross-cutting themes across these presentations. So to start with, I'll invite Elena Willis to present her study around what matters most around care and decision making for parents of children with complex needs. Thank you, Elena.
Thank you so much. I conducted qualitative interviews with mothers whose children had either complex life-limiting or complex life-threatening needs, and I just wanted to highlight some of the key practice implications that emerged from my results. And these complement a lot of what's already been said today, and it's been fascinating to hear all the other talks. So mothers highlighted that integrated, flexible and individualised care is really important. Their children are under multiple teams, their health is prone to rapid change, and we need to hold on to the individual at the heart of care. I think mothers feel supported when professionals manage to hold on to or are interested in a holistic view of the child and the family, so a sense of what they're dealing with at home on a day-to-day basis, the needs of other members of the family. And when professionals can promote some normality and family time, that really does make a difference. I think if we can free up through good communication and consistency so that mothers have time and energy for some of those normal moments with their children and the rest of the family. Guidance and advocacy was really important as well, being proactive together with mothers, making sure they're not having to learn the hard way, sharing expertise, anticipating need, and really encouraging them to take up support because they're in this for the long haul and we know the effects on mothers' health and well-being. The values of trust, hope and truth were really interesting, particularly in relation to decision making. I think when mothers felt involved in some of the more day-to-day decisions, that helped them when they were then discussing difficult choices with professionals. Early advanced care planning is really beneficial, identifying some of those goals and values that are shared between families, and thinking about what matters most to them, and that can be a really useful starting point actually, and that changes over time. I've learned that families experience discrimination due to disability and assumptions are made around that, and mums shared with me really good examples of agreed written plans actually ensuring access to appropriate treatment during emergency situations and then relieving their anxiety. Another interesting thing that emerged was around mothers' own identity and sense of purpose. So they are a mum, they're an amazingly skilled caregiver, and they're also an individual in their own right, and that can sometimes get lost and impact on their coping. I think actually just taking part in this study A lot of mothers were really grateful for the opportunity to do that, and they wanted to share their story, and that gave them a real sense of purpose and meaning. It was also interesting when thinking about their own expertise. It was highlighted in the results that they need increased support at times of vulnerability, that it's a balance that is constantly in flux, but there are times when, say, their child's condition is deteriorating, or they're in a new phase of care or a new setting, that increased support is really beneficial. And also the opportunity to explore decisions and options and minimise regret. I think my sort of messages in a nutshell of what matters most are genuine care for the individuals, an appreciation of what's at stake for them, and the opportunity for them to engage in decision making early on can be really beneficial. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. That's a very rich set of data you've collected in that study, and it'll be good to discuss that further in the Q&A. So just to remind people to pop questions in the Q&A as we go along, before you forget what somebody said because you've listened to another presentation. So next, we'd like to invite Louise Warwick from the University of Southampton. She's going to tell us about some work they're doing in adapting an existing measure of family members' reports of quality of life after death of a family member. Thank you, Louise.
Thanks very much. So our research has been working on the evaluation of the quality of end-of-life care, and goes back some years, and resulted at one stage in the development of a questionnaire for use with bereaved relatives and carers for adults. So this questionnaire has been used extensively. This is the Views of Informal Carers Evaluation of Services short form, the Voices form. It's been used for national and international surveys, including a national survey for end-of-life care led by the Office for National Statistics and NHS England. So we want to use this questionnaire as the starting point for the development of a tool to evaluate the quality of end-of-life care for children after having identified a gap in the research literature around quality of end-of-life care for children, measured through feedback from bereaved parents and carers. So the Voices short form was our starting point. We used, looking at this middle section of the slide here, we used a literature review and then cognitive interviews with healthcare professionals and with parents to understand what the key issues were that needed to be included in this children's questionnaire. So that was undertaken, and the questionnaire, the adult questionnaire, adapted for use with children, the first iteration of the questionnaire. That moved into then a pre-testing stage of cognitive interviews with healthcare professionals, and will be followed by cognitive interviews with parents. We are presenting the results of the analysis of the data from the interviews with healthcare professionals in this slide. So we did a content and a thematic analysis. The content analysis led to suggestions for structural changes in, for example, order and grouping of questions, content changes around rewording, revising, clarifying questions, and then clarifying the understanding of some of the terminology that we'd used. The thematic analysis showed an overarching theme of respect, and then 3 sub-themes, which were all around language. There was clarity of language, sensitive use of language, and the language of shared understanding. The quotes in that top right-hand corner of the slide come from specific questions that led us to the themes. So for example, we asked a question that said, did you use out of hours, urgent and out of hours care? And the healthcare professionals said to us, well, there could be different meanings for out of hours care. Does it include a call to the physio or a call to the hospital to get admitted? So comments like that led us to the development of the theme, the sub-theme around clarity of language. Regarding the sensitive use of language, this was around the unintentional tendency to mislead by the language we used. The healthcare professionals demonstrated a deep respect for the respondents as bereaved parents. And they showed us and told us that they were desperate to avoid distress for the parents, which was demonstrated in the things that they said to us. So, for example, one of the questions that we asked was your child looked after in a caring way? Comments that came back to us from the healthcare professionals were around, well, does this imply that parents are not worried about their child? Does it refer to trust, or does it refer to comfort? So responses like that led us to the development of the theme around the sensitive use of language. And then around the language of shared understanding, which did include their a recognition that they also used jargon as we all do in research and health and shouldn't. One of the questions we asked in the questionnaire was, did you place your trust in the healthcare professionals? Comments came back to us from the healthcare professionals saying, trust is a challenging word. Trust is a massive thing if children are going to die. So that led us, along with other comments around that question, to realise the importance of using a language of a shared understanding, that we all were speaking about the same thing. So to conclude, the healthcare professionals provided valuable insight for us into the potential impact of this questionnaire on parents. What we'll be going on to next is testing out with parents. They told us they had a strong sense of empathy for those parents, and they were deeply respectful towards them. They told us about the importance of care with words and the need to avoid jargon. And there was a strong emphasis on language, specifically around clarity, sensitivity, and understanding. Thank you. And just as I conclude, I want to mention at this point that I'm going to be joined in the Q&A session by my colleague who leads on this work, Professor Anne-Sophie Darlington. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Louise. That's a really interesting study that you're sort of part way through, and it'd be very interesting to sort of track that going forward in terms of the actual measure being available. So thank you very much. So next we have Marie from Belgium, and she's really picking up on a theme that we've thought about quite a lot today, about the measurement of outcomes. And we're presenting on some work they've been doing to adapt the Africa version of the CPOS. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you, Bryony. So yes, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share some insights about this pilot study, which was part of a wider study conducted in the frame of my PhD at the UC Louvain in Brussels. So although we know all that pediatric palliative care aims to promote in quality of life for children and their parents, we already have seen this morning through the conference from Richard Hadding that it's difficult to assess this construct, which is a tricky one. And in Belgium, yes, assessing quality of life is also an ethical and social challenge, because at the moment, pediatric liaison teams, which provide curative and palliative care to children, don't use any instruments to measure these outcomes. So the results today presented were conducted in a collaborative and iterative way at one center of pediatric palliative care in Brussels. And we wanted to assess the phase and content validity of the African Palliative Care Association, CPOS, and to see if it measures children's and parents' quality of life, but also to see if it's assessed the acceptability by children and parents, what the question asks, and its feasibility of use by pediatric liaison teams, because we know that one instrument, if it's only created but not used, it's really not important, or it's useless. So after a cross-cultural validation of the APCA CPOS from English to French, we conducted semi-structured interviews with children and parents who were cared for by pediatric liaison teams. And we used the APCA CPOS, the translated version one, but also an individual quality of life interview guide, which is called the cycle. So we could verify with the self-elicited dimensions that matters most to children, if those dimensions were already included in the APGA-CPOS, and if there were new dimensions which could maybe emerged. And so we saw that, in fact, the dimensions included in the original APGA-CPOS were all confirmed, but there were new dimensions, such, for example, this importance for social relations and social interactions with peers, with family members, with friends, but also administrative or financial issues encountered by parents. So this led our results led to an adapted version in French with 22 questions, which could explore the child's quality of life and the parent's quality of life through a self-report possibility, but also a proxy report if the child could not express himself. We found also that the children and parents which were interviewed really valued this time to share their experiences and to respond to those questions. And it wasn't a burden at all for them, which was a bit the fear of the academic field when we conducted this research, but also from ethical committees' approvals. So we're very grateful for the collaboration with Yves Namisango from the APGA, but also with Julia Dorning and Richard Harding, who co-authored a common paper on this pilot study. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie. That's a lovely piece of work. And it's always so good to hear, isn't it, when parents and children say how much they value the opportunity for their voices to be heard and their views to be sort of noted and recorded. So that's a great message, not just from your paper, but a number of papers we've had today. That's really great. Thank you. So next we have Emily Parsons, who's a senior staff nurse at Guy's and St Thomas's in London. And she's going to tell us about a scoping review she's done on studies which have looked at parents' experiences and perceptions of conflict with healthcare professionals. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. So myself and my colleague Anne-Sophie Darlington at the University of Southampton, we completed a scoping review. I'm sure many of you know that conflict is fairly prevalent, I would say, in paediatric healthcare and can be really damaging to children and their families and their well-being, but also staff well-being and also resources in the NHS as well. So we completed this scoping review to collate views from parents that already existed in the literature because we couldn't find any collective review on focusing on conflict from parents' perspectives. There was already a bit of information about healthcare professionals' opinions. So we also wanted to map the views that we found from parents onto those by professionals. And to do this, we used some causes identified in Forbat et al. From a healthcare professional's perspective, which were communication breakdown, disagreements over treatment, and unrealistic expectations. So these, in the white box here, you can see the findings that we found. And the top box there considers the circumstantial influencing factors that parents identified that made them more vulnerable to conflict but didn't directly cause it. And then the other 7 are our themes that we identified from the papers. So the things that we found particularly of interest was that parents felt it really important to be recognised as the expert for their child. And that might be in their rare conditions, or it could be in sort of communicating, perhaps if they're non-verbal communicators, or even just recognising the cues that we may not pick up on as not knowing that child as well as the parents do. But also perceptions of suffering was something that could lead to disagreements. So suffering is obviously quite subjective, and actually there were disagreements surrounding the extent to which a child is suffering, and also what level of suffering is acceptable. And this is variable between different families and also different professionals, which makes it quite challenging to come to a consensus at times. Whereas suffering is such an important thing to determine what level of treatment is offered to a child, it's probably something worth examining a bit further, really. Parents also identified varying approaches to decision making as something that can cause conflict. So different understandings of what best interest is, where parents want to focus entirely on best interest of that child, whereas professionals might be prone to thinking of them in their wider family context, whereas parents might find that challenging in itself. And these circumstantial factors are interesting that parents brought that to light. So exhaustion in particular can make intensify the feelings of stress and grief that are already going on, and then also make it difficult to retain complex medical facts. And like I said, these things don't cause the conflict necessarily, but can make people more vulnerable to disagreements and struggle to find a consensus. So in terms of comparing with professional views, this study shows some similarities. So communication breakdown was similar, understanding between professionals and parents, and also the fact that disagreements occur over treatment, particularly around futility of treatment perhaps, or burden versus benefit of treatment. But also that parents actually have lots of very nuanced and unique views that aren't represented in the papers focusing on healthcare professionals. And actually, if we want to, limit the impact of conflict, then we really need to look into this at a deeper level to work out the sort of dynamics of conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was such a clear presentation in such a short period of time of such a complex issue. Really interesting. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that that we can talk about in the time for discussion after our final presentation. So just another reminder to pop your questions in the Q&A function while we're just listening to our final presentation, which is a PhD student from the Martin House Research Centre, and she's going to be talking about her work on music therapy. Thank you, Vicky.
Thanks, Bryony. Hi, I've been working in children's palliative care for nearly 20 years as a music therapist. In my recorded presentation, I shared the development, implementation and research into a collaborative model of working with bereaved siblings of children with life-limiting or life-threatening conditions in a children's hospice setting. The model of working was named Rocks and Pebbles, which makes reference to an analogy of grief, perhaps becoming less painful to manage over time. I undertook a research project in order to provide an evidence base for the practice of this model of working and to gain external funding for this group. This was a small-scale research project, and due to time constraints around funding and gaining ethical approval, we focused on the perspective of the professionals involved in the project rather than the experience of the children. However, the children's voices are central to group evaluation and design, and a follow-up study which focuses on the children and families' perspective is planned. The research questions are highlighted on this summary slide for you to read through. A qualitative research methodology was chosen as we were interested in studying words and description on a small-scale level. Semi-structured interviews were used as a research method to closely analyse the experience of the professionals and to explore individual perspectives. Interpretative phenomenological analysis was used to analyse and interpret the data to explore the professionals' viewpoints and offer a description of the findings in order to explore interpretations of these. Recurrent themes were identified across the interview transcriptions and then grouped into broader domains in order to interpret the work. 23 themes emerged from the data, which were subsequently grouped into 4 domain headings, which were the role of music, the impact on the professional of the collaboration and how this influenced the work, the professional experience and the future development of the model. Conclusions were reached regarding the unique role of music in this model and more generally in collaborative work, far-reaching benefits of collaborative work for both client and therapist, and the significance of support in this clinical area. This research has important outcomes for both the music therapy profession and wider childhood bereavement services through the exploration of this model and a more general investigation into collaborative working and post-bereavement support groups. The evidence base for the effectiveness of this model of post-bereavement support has enabled annual external funding to be gained, and there has been significant interest in this model of working within paediatric palliative care. It's hoped that this research will provide a welcome addition to the growing literature within collaborative working in music therapy and childhood bereavement, particularly in terms of enhancing the work and supporting the professionals. I want to leave you with the words of the children and families. I enjoy being around other kids in the same situation as me. He feels now he doesn't feel he's the only one and was able to express his feelings. And music helps a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Lovely to have a paper that's focused particularly on siblings in today's conference, and also one that's looking at what we might call a sort of the less sort of traditional sort of types of interventions that are available. So that's a lovely paper to end this session on. So could could we ask all the presenters now to switch their videos on? So it looks like we've got some questions coming in, and we'll try and take these from the top, which I'm just going to work out where the top is. Sorry, Bob, have you been?
Yeah, no, I think the first question that comes in from this this angle is from Katie White, and is addressed to Eleanor, whose study was around the experience of mothers of children with life-limiting and conditions. The questions around whether you had thought about exploring this with fathers as well, and if you have any thoughts on that, reflecting maybe on the previous review that happened as well.
Yeah, really good question, and it was fascinating because I designed the study to invite parents to participate, so it wasn't just focused on mothers, fathers were invited as well, and I invited 19 couples or single parents, so there were 34 parents invited altogether, and it was the mothers who volunteered to participate. So that was really fascinating, and obviously it's a limitation, and it's something that I've reflected on, considering why that might be, and I think there's several possible explanations for that. I think because I conducted the interviews after the first lockdown last year, and they were telephone interviews, it wasn't necessarily physical access, but possibly changes to work pattern might have had something to do with it. But interviews, I mean, they took place day or evening, so I tried to be as flexible as possible, but I'd be interested to hear from other people about whether they've got recommendations on getting a sort of equality in terms of participation.
Thank you. I think
perhaps I could just, in response to that, Eleanor, just say that's something that the involvement of fathers is something that we've been increasingly kind of conscious and aware of in the research we do at the Martin House Research Centre. And actually, there's just been a sort of small group set up to look at this issue and look at our practice and what we need to do around making our research meaningful and accessible and interesting to fathers. And that's sort of being coordinated by one of the researchers, Julia Hackett. So I'm sure if you wanted to contact her, she can fill you in on where they've got with that little piece of work that we're doing within the centre. But yeah, it's a huge issue. So not just your study that encounters that.
Can I just check this is something that I've been made aware of by the PPI involvement, is the idea that there is often a primary carer and maybe a secondary carer if there's two parents looking after, and that's traditionally or majority wise is the mum takes the primary carer role and the dad takes the secondary carer role. And were the mums that were involved in yours the primary carers for the children?
Good question as well. I think the majority were, but not necessarily. And interestingly, part of the sort of end of the interview discussion was around what participation had been like for the parents. So I had feedback on the actual interview experience from them, and I also fed back my results to them once I'd finished.
Yeah.
One of the parents was really interested that I hadn't got father's voice, and said that actually if there was future research, her partner would be really keen to take part because they had shared things equally and he had different but very astute perspective. So, but I think the majority of the participants would probably see themselves as the primary caregiver.
Thank you.
So I think we had some questions for Louise. I'm scrolling down and I can't find it, but it was something along the lines of we were interested in why you decided to adapt the Voices C rather than create a new questionnaire from scratch.
So it seemed to us to make sense to use a validated questionnaire because we thought that there would be some questions that would be relevant for children equally as adults, and therefore there was that sort of feeling that it made sense. So some of the questions would stay the same. And then also we thought it would be, the findings would be similar. It would be interesting to compare the findings with the findings that we'd had from the adult questionnaire. That was the rationale behind it. Yeah.
I had a question about whether or not the intention is that ONS will start using your voices adapted version as part of their sort of instruments that they use for the annual survey of people who've experienced bereavement.
So as far as I know, yeah, we didn't have that as one of our aims, but I think Anne-Sophie would be happy to respond to that question.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm just here to hi everyone to kind of support. But yes, I would say that I think that would be really great. I think there's such a wealth of data through the ONS with the adult voices survey, and wouldn't it be great if we could have many similar questions in the children's version that cover a lot of aspects but have additional ones, and then make some comparisons, because I think it would add such value in making the case for so many of the care things that need to be implemented.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
We've got a similar question for Marie on a similar theme of taking one version and validating and adapting it versus the thing we heard this morning about generating a children's version from scratch, sort of. The question is, do you think that the adaptation that you've made of the African CPOS will end up being the same or different than the approach that's been done, that we heard about this morning, that's driving on to create a CPOS within the UK or that environment from scratch upwards?
Thank you. Yes. I don't know if it will be the same. We hope that the collaboration, or also the informal collaboration between the different researchers, will continue, so that we can really share our experiences. What we found by, for example, already sharing the results of the systematic review conducted by Eve Namisango and her team, and with our team here in Brussels, is that in fact, the importance for children were at the moment not explored yet. So it's really important to have those dimensions self-elicited by children, what matters most to them. What we wanted to also to know is if in the CPOS it was if this instrument was able to assess quality of life. Not only care outcomes, but also the quality of life, which is really holistic and multidimensional, as we know. So that's why we added other instruments to compare and to have those possibilities also from a psychometric property point of view. So we'll see. I'm looking forward to see the end of the results and to continue sharing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Marie, I listened to your whole presentation earlier, and something that struck me and has stayed with me is a quote from a young person who talked about living with fear all the time. And I just wondered, sort of from the Belgian perspective, what provision is there for children, young people around their sort of emotional and psychological needs in Belgium?
Yes, thank you, Bryony. So there is, of course, psychological support systematically provided for each child who can be cared for by a pediatric liaison team. But we found in another study that the access to those teams were probably insufficient.
Right.
So there would be probably other associations or organisms or societies who can help them. But at the moment, we see that those teams which are trained in pediatric palliative care, and they are the only one which are trained in that, are probably insufficient in Belgium. So we are looking also for different types of informal support groups for those children who are maybe not cared for by those pediatric liaison teams, but who can access support help groups and also through creative activities or respite care activities. For example, there are 3 respite care facilities in Belgium where they can make some stays alone or some with family members. So there are, of course, also other entries to access those support.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Interesting to hear about differences between countries in what's available and models of delivery.
The models are all quite different, aren't they, in different places? Even within different regions within a country, and certainly between countries, strikingly different.
I think once we've got these measures, we can do cross-country comparisons and then share that learning. So that's really, really interesting and encouraging to see the work done on measure development.
We've got questions on Emily on your presentation around conflict. Wondering if you spotted if there were any differences in the type and level of conflict that occurred with the age of the child in question, so the index child, from an adult hospice perspective, where the conflicts appear different than the ones described in the children's area.
Yeah, that wasn't something we looked at for our study because we were obviously just doing a kind of widespread review to find out what was there. But what I think may or may not be applicable, but parents really wanted to draw attention to the impact that their previous experiences had had on their current day conflict. So we may come into it thinking this is the event that's occurring here is what the problem is. But actually, I can imagine if you get to some of your young people that get to be in adult hospices, it's just important to bear in mind how much they've already been through and how many, and the whole families, how many little interactions have built up to the situation that they're in then. So I don't think I saw we didn't look for any significant differences between age groups, but I have no doubt that that will be impactful. So for the older the child is, the more, well, trajectory of the illness, I suppose, not necessarily directly the age, but the conversations they've already had building up to that point that really can't be underestimated when you're then approaching them as an adult service to have.
Another question on that area was within what you've described as sort of the cause and the nature of those conflicts, was there anything that seemed to emerge that was about how to resolve conflict when it was occurring?
I think largely speaking, it's definitely about understanding somebody else's perspective. Ideally, those things sort of happen before the conflict occurs, but that obviously doesn't always happen. But trying to go back to those basics, those fundamentals that are underpinning the thing that you're talking about, because often the thing that you're talking about and having a conflict about is actually, there's so much that underlays that. If we can establish where we're both coming from, but also perhaps recognizing and dealing with the smaller day-to-day conflicts that might occur. But conflicts are broad term, it's not always really dramatic, horrible situations, but actually it's easier often to think, oh, I've appeased that situation, so we'll just let that lie. Whereas actually, if we could have a conversation with parents at the small stages of conflicts and see what's going on here that we're doing that's creating this situation, or what can we do differently to make those conflicts easier, that actually then hopefully will try and stop it kind of emerging into something big later down the line when you have to make a really critical decision.
Eleanor, looks like you've got a comment on that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that rings true from what some of the mothers talked to me about. Disagreements weren't always a negative experience, and actually they talked about how at the time it felt difficult, but if a professional recognised that an issue was important to them and they could work through it and perhaps come back to it the next day or soon, that was actually really positive and that could build a trusting relationship. So that was a fascinating thread that I'd picked up, and it's just really interesting to hear you from your perspective.
Yeah, some parents also said the positive about disagreements was that they felt like actually all the options had been explored and they could then be, okay, the decision has been made, but I know because we've sort of talked through this together, even if it is a bit difficult and a bit of a conflict at the time, actually when you get to the end you think, okay, well, we've talked through every other eventuality that might occur, so I feel like we've come to that decision together.
I have another question, Emily, about whether there's anything in your review which looked at the sort of role of second opinions.
Actually, no, it wasn't mentioned in the papers that we found, but we were pulling together ideas of conflict and disagreement in papers that weren't necessarily focused on conflict and disagreement. So it was things that were sort of discussed in reviews that might be about decision making more broadly, or might be about parents' views on such and such. So it might have been that it actually is out there and related to that, but it wasn't something that we pulled through. So it wasn't in any of the things that we put together, but it's interesting.
I had another sort of follow-up question, both for you and for Eleanor, because both of you referred to this notion of like decision regret and trying to avoid making decisions you later sort of regret. And it struck me as quite interesting that that is something that we all do as decision makers. And so parents obviously will be thinking that will be part of what their processing is on. But then there's this sense that the healthcare professional is trying to work in such a way so that the parent doesn't regret the decision they make. So there's that sort of other sort of process going on, and how that will be sort of the health professionals' reading of the situation will influence how they try to manage that. So I didn't know if you had any sort of reflections on that, either of you, about that sort of notion of avoiding regret.
I definitely think that's important from what we pulled together, because parents were very much feeling like they were in a crisis, and they want you to be focusing on that and focusing on the child and getting the child through this or whatever's right for them. And I think they pick up on that kind of our want to kind of manage the later outcomes as well. And I'm sure it's not the case for all parents, but for some of the people here, they discussed that felt like it was a distraction from dealing with the initial kind of care for that child. And I'm sure that's not always the case, but it's definitely something I think we need to be a bit aware of, really.
I think some of the participants that I talked to were well aware of the reality of their situation and how fragile their child's health was, but they were balancing that against some hope to keep going, to keep being proactive, not because the situation could be fixed, but to try and make it as good as possible.
Yeah. That's a very complex things going on. Thank you both.
We've got a series of questions about the music intervention, Vicky. People wondering about all sorts of things related to it. To start with, who was it that was involved in the intervention?
So the there was community musicians, and there was myself as a music therapist, and there's a counsellor and creative arts therapist. So we were all interviewed as part of the professional's experience.
Sorry, can I because that's now using jargon, and as a jargon user, I now feel like I'm on the end of it. A community musician.
Yeah. So yes, I suppose I am using jargon, aren't I? Now it's really good to differentiate, because a community musician is musicians who are not trained music therapists, but they're using music in healthcare, and they're working with a lot of similar outcomes, but it's often really quite different work. So we collaborated, and they're not qualified music therapists, but they are working in healthcare as musicians, professional musicians. So these were musicians that came from the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra education and community team,
who would turn up and do their musical thing, but hadn't got the therapy background alongside that.
That's it. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And that's helped me understand that. And then there are a number of questions about who else might it be useful for, and what data is there for other groups. So you've looked at siblings in a bereaved siblings, but then there are questions around siblings that aren't bereaved, directly with patients. What about parents and grandparents? Is there anything out there?
There isn't very much. Certainly in our project, we involved the family, so the parents were involved as well, so they were able to be part of that and exploring their emotions as a family through music. And we are extending the work to look at bereaved children generally. So working in adult hospices as well. I mean, there's many music therapists across the profession using music to help people explore their emotions, particularly grief. But this was our particular model of work, in which we started at the point of bereaved siblings, because I guess if you think about, for children, how difficult it can be to articulate their feelings, full stop, and then And then that further element of, I mean, society finds it so difficult to talk about death and grief, and then often the children aren't part of those conversations. I think we've been sort of exploring a lot of that today and thinking about protecting children from conversations. So it's that other layer. There's a book called The Forgotten Mourners, which is about bereaved siblings, and I think often those conversations aren't happening at home because they want everybody in the family is wanting to protect one another. They don't want to upset one another by talking potentially about their bereavement. So yeah, so that's why we focus on bereaved siblings' needs. We felt in the hospice that was very, very much an area that we needed to focus on.
Thank you. I'm now spotting that people are wondering how to get in touch with these community musicians, and is it free? But I'll possibly let you answer that in the chat rather than just give out people's contact numbers over the emails. We've had a couple of sort of broad questions as well, and one thing that I was wondering about was, do you know, have we explored other sort of craft-based therapies in the same way? Clearly you're coming from music therapy experience, but I'm guessing there'll be some kids that are not very good with music but would like to do drawing and making things, and would you see it being a similar area, in a similar way that we could explore the other craft therapies?
Yeah, I think there's I mean, we did actually use a lot of different creative mediums. So we used art and we used sculpture, we used all sorts actually, because yeah, as you say, music, it's not going to be for everybody. And also we very much, when we went out to children to do sort of home visits and introduce ourselves, and because it's a big deal coming along to a group like this when they may not know the other children, they may not know us, and we want to reassure them. And a lot of their fears were, well, I'm not musical, how can I be part of this? So it's about reassuring people that we're all musical beings. But yes, absolutely, we use lots of different creative mediums, and I think a lot of the childhood bereavement programs mainly do focus on sort of using more arts-based creative arts as a medium of expression, and so this is our sort of way of building on from that.
Thank you.
Another very general question, and probably not even specific to this session, and I'm not sure how we'll manage responses to this, but I just alert people in the Q&A to a question that Emily's Hawthorne's raised around, is anyone aware of any past or current research surrounding how same-sex couples experience services and when their child has a life-limiting or life-threatening condition? So we've sort of talked about fathers, but we sort of have I think perhaps that conversation's been sort of based on a sort of mother-father parent partnership, but that's another interesting area that I'm not sure I've come across any work in that area. But if people have, perhaps they could just Lorna says she'd like to respond to this. Lorna.
I was trying to type, sorry, I'm clearly pressing the wrong button. I'm not aware of any, but there's clearly a need. So yes, if anybody else is, then please do share. Sorry, I'll go away now.
That's all right.
I can be very oncological in the answer. I'm broadly in cancer services for grown-ups going into young adulthood. There has been a fair bit of experience-based work for LGBTQ plus individuals and the challenges that they've experienced, and now very clearly within certain areas of cancer care, gendered areas of cancer care. So you might think about prostate cancer, you might think about uterine cervix, so cervical cancer, cervical smearing. A lot of work done to try and broaden an experience so that people who are trans or non-binary aren't excluded from the programs in the same way. And there has been work within that of the feeling of being a same-sex couple whose child is involved, but with the primarily focused on the adults. And we're taking on, along with the sort of leaders in the adult practice from this, we're taking on a project within children's cancer broadly, but not a wide area of LTCs, which is hopefully kicking off later on this year. to really understand experience, but from the health professional point of view, and there's work trying to explain that from the parent and young person perspective as well. But that's a bit slower behind from what we've been doing.
And it's a shame that Richard Harding's not here, because Richard actually leads a large body of work in adult palliative care around palliative care for the LGBTQ+ community. So it's probably a question for him as well, to see what he's aware of any work in children.
But people can contact you, Bob, about the work going on in the primary treatment centres.
Within the Peds Oncology setting, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. There's been a few comments, sort of just comments really in the Q&A around how, and they really, I think, probably reflect the way that a lot of research to date has been around mothers' perspectives, mothers' experiences, and we've sort of been, that's something that's really kind of been picked up, I think, in this afternoon sessions, is about the father's voice. And certainly that's something in the family advisory board for the centre. It's so good that we've got a great mix of mothers and fathers on that group, and the perspectives they bring. But that's certainly a takeaway for us around sort of future work. I'm just checking through any other questions or comments. I don't think there's been any more that I can see, Bob. I don't know if you can see.
No, there's an awful lot of people saying how good the presentations are. So that's excellent.
Yeah.
We're really chuffed about that.
Yeah.
But I can't see any other overarching questions through there.
Well, we've timed that very well then, because it's just about time to finish. So I think on behalf of Bob and myself, thank you for some fantastic presentations. Thank you for being so clear, despite the challenges of just one slide in 3 minutes. I think absolutely fantastic how much information you've managed to convey, and to remind people again that you can watch the full presentations, 10-minute presentations. They're all up on the conference website, so do go there to sort of hear a sort of expanded versions of those fantastic presentations.